back, everybody. Today we are back at The Job is Easy. The People Are Not. Top 10 Smart Skills to help people become better. Today is my absolute pleasure to be with an extraordinary person, an extraordinary researcher, and somebody that has taught me in a few days more than I have learned about this topic in years, my colleague, Professor YiRen Wang. And today we're going to talk about the smart skill that we call productive inclusion. Welcome, YiRen.
Thank you, Loredana. I'm so happy to be here.
So let's go straight into it. How do you define productive inclusion? And I just want to tell everybody, I have 30 pages of notes from just a few conversations that we had together. And I feel like even today I'm going to learn so much more. So guys, don't mind if I take notes. But like I said, I'm learning so much every time I'm talking to you. So let's go back. How do we define productive inclusion?
So this is actually a term that you brought to me. I never thought about my research can be branded or framed in a way that's called productive inclusion, but after you talk to me, it makes so much sense. So the way I think about it is, for managers, we really want to create an environment that makes everybody feel like they are equally treated and they have equal access to resources and opportunities, especially for those coming from marginalized backgrounds, such as people from vulnerable families, people from economic disadvantages conditions, and those from maybe refugee backgrounds. We really need to be ready for creating an environment that recognizes and celebrates, even creates a system that rewards and reinforces people to bring in unique talents, and for managers to utilize their talents and make them feel more included. So I really think this is an important skill to have.
Yeah, to be very honest, I haven't really thought about this skill as one of the top 10 smart skills in our set until I started reading your research and I sat in some of your talks. And the more I thought about it, and then I connected it with some of the MIT work in the space of poverty, in the space of inclusion, it made me realize that studying poverty is very important. Studying engagement of poor people, like you said, productive inclusion is important, but it also has a massive economic impact, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I really think this is so important for business leaders to be aware of. And now we're living in a world where resources are not equally distributed, unfortunately. Some people are just born with privileges. Maybe they're born in a wealthy background and everything comes so easy for them to pursue dreams, to give up, and to take the risk of pursuing something that can be a little bit uncertain. But a lot of people are not as fortunate. They were born in a more poor background. And truth is that business leaders oftentimes want to save costs. They want to save expenses. So you have jobs in your organization that are relatively lower paid, and you have employees that are considered relatively lower status within your organization hierarchy. And why not make your workplace more inclusive for everybody, regardless of their background, to feel inclusive? And if you don't, then you run into the risk of people hating working for you, and they quit more often, and they are not as engaged, they are not as committed. So you need to spend later more cost on training a new set of employees. You spend more time worrying about their morale and the issues that they bring into your workplaces. So that's also a negative economic impact to your organization. And for government, for social policy makers, there are so many more good reasons for you to pay attention to the issue of reducing poverty and helping the society to be better and more fair.
So it's not just that it's good for the society, but it's actually good for the pocket of big companies, of governments. It's expensive for a country to have too many poor people, right?
That's right, exactly. So
as somebody who's spent most of their adult life studying this topic, can you tell me what motivated you to go into this field? What's the reason? Why are you so fascinated? Why are you so interested in this?
Yeah, it has something to do with me growing up in Taiwan. So I was born and raised in Taiwan, which is a relatively homogeneous country in terms of the people's race and ethnicity. And we hire a lot of migrant workers from the Southeastern Asian countries, especially in an important gap in our labor market, which is the needs for taking care of people with severe illness and the elderly with severe dementia, for example, and also a lot of the manual works. Those are the jobs that most Taiwanese don't want to do because they are really heavy, tough, and relatively lower paid. So we ended up hiring a lot of workers from Southeastern Asian countries, and we supposedly need to be grateful of these people helping us take care of our loved ones. But what they end up experiencing was being mistreated, being discriminated, and being thought inferior to the Taiwanese. And I grew up...
Even though they were helping the families of Taiwanese, right?
That's right. So growing up, I heard statements that people make about these people, such as, you know, migrant workers are here just to earn wages. They don't care about morale. They don't care about other things. And they are... you know, they're the source of lots of societal problems. And I always thought it was very weird hearing that. It made me uncomfortable, but I didn't know what was so wrong about it. And then later in my life, I became a PhD student in the United States, in which I happened to have chances to move around between different cities. And I had lived in a city where there are a lot of rich people, and I happened to also lived in another state where it's relatively poor. And I have seen people begging for food and money on the street. And I saw those drastic differences in the income that people have.
In the same country.
In the same country. Even in the same city as well, in the same county, I saw a lot of the differences. And I also heard people making statements about the other group that's different from them, such as poor people are lazier, that's why they're on the street. They probably are drug addicts. They do something wrong, so that's why they're suffering. So those statements made me wonder, we are making explanations of others' consequences and others' life circumstances every day. And are these statements ever being tested and ever being compared with other explanations? Are we making legitimate judgments about others? So I became very interested as a researcher in hoping that I can use my research to help people understand the challenges that people from underprivileged backgrounds face and what's stopping them from showing proactive and productive behaviors that are traditionally recognized and celebrated within workplaces, and also help managers understand what are some biases they may easily introduce to the workplaces when they are interacting with people from
So what you're saying is that we're making assumptions about people from poor backgrounds, for example, assumptions which are very strong. For example, poor people are lazy, but we actually don't really understand the cause.
Right. So that's why I wanted to look into this as a researcher. So if you don't mind, I can share a little bit about what I have found in the past.
Yeah, of course.
So, you know, there are some research findings that suggest there's a relationship between people from poor background and also the rate of proactive behaviors. And so the relationship is negative. What they found is that poor people are less likely to make suggestions to the organization leaders in terms of how they can better carry out their task, how they can be more efficient. They voice out less. They also have fewer career aspirations. They are less likely to be interested in participating in training sessions and self-development sessions. So one may think...
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Right. And it's counterintuitive because you might think they are the ones who should be... who need it the most and who can benefit from those training sessions the most, while not developing new skills to help their careers in the long run, for example. So the conclusion that's easily being jumped to is, they're not trying hard enough to help themselves. That's why they are poor and they are still in the lower social status, right? So in one of my research, I wanted to provide an alternative explanation for why that might be the case. And the way that I looked at it is a lot of things that we are talking about and we are placing judgments on are people's choices that involve consideration of time. So this is probably a bit complicated, but I will explain it in more details. So, for example, career development. It's a choice that we need to make between now and the future. So, for example, I need to spend resources, I need to spend time and money to learn a new skill.
Yeah.
But then the benefit of developing a new skill may not come to me until a delayed future.
Yeah.
So then we are, because of the limited resources we have, we are trading off the resources that we can use for now versus later.
Yeah, it's almost I cannot afford to invest in my future because my present is so scarce of resources, right?
That's right. So that's exactly what I looked at in that particular project. I looked at how economic disadvantages makes people to have shortened time horizon, focus so much on the present needs at the expense of future considerations.
So what you're saying is somebody who's very, very poor has a job, right? But it's a job that probably allows them to only survive from a day to another or from a month to another. They don't really have the same perception of the time horizon that somebody who's slightly more affluent, and we're not talking about rich people here, but we're just talking about people who are not in the highest poverty range,
That's
correct?
right, exactly.
And if you're extremely poor, your focus is very much on today, surviving today. It's too expensive to think far in the future because that future, it's almost unattainable.
Exactly. So that's so-called scarcity mindset. I didn't invent this word, but I came across the theory on resource scarcity, and that was the word used. And I think it describes this concept so well. Yeah. So we have this tunnel focus on the things that are immediately pressing to us, and then it runs at a risk of paying less attention to things that are very important and very costly to us in the future.
I'm getting a little bit emotional because I don't think I ever said this to anybody, but for a very, very short amount of time, fortunately, in my life, I was a little bit homeless in the sense that I didn't have a place to stay. I didn't know exactly what tomorrow is going to bring. I was living in a time where my country was going through a massive crisis. And I remember the only thing that mattered for me was knowing that I can survive until tomorrow morning. It was as bad as, can I find a place tonight where it's safe enough that I can see the light of day tomorrow?
Right.
So I can only imagine if that's your reality, how can you even think about, let me get a training or something like that.
Developing new skill and investing for an uncertain future, right?
I think of even sometimes the fact that a quarter, 25 cents, can make the difference between today and tomorrow, right?
Exactly. And it's a perspective very difficult for people not in that situation to take. So thank you so much for sharing that. That's wonderful. And I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm so glad to see you being so well now. Yeah,
well, we all have moments in life where, you're thrown in situations where you think like, how did I end up here? But I think this time horizon observation is such a new one because I don't think I ever thought about how time affects the way we make decisions and how time affects somebody who is in a perpetual state of poverty.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And speaking of MIT, Professor Duflo, who won a Nobel Prize in this field, also spends a lot of time thinking. And like I said, I think there's a misconception, and this brings me maybe to more of a social sustainability conversation here. There's a misconception that the poor are not our responsibility. It's not a cost to the economy. They are poor by choice. They are lazy by choice. It's their own fault for doing what they are doing. And I think your research demonstrates that there's actually a responsibility on our side, not only to be more inclusive, which I have to say this whole thing about inclusion and diversity, it's a little bit dangerous because it's a little bit of forced inclusion and diversity, right? We all have to tick a box. But at the manager's level, at the frontline workers and direct supervisors, there's also a lot of correction that we need to do, right? You also study what's the relationship between the line managers and the poor people that they report to. What did you learn about what should managers do? The direct managers, I'm not talking about CEOs and presidents and things like that.
Yeah, so first of all, that's a very good way to put for my research findings, which is we really need to understand the contextual influences of these working poor, and really need to know better of why they are behaving in a way that seems lazy, but maybe because of the situation they're coming from stops them from planning ahead of time and investing into the future. So for recommending managers, I really think that managers should have the mindsets ready to be able to understand the challenges that everybody working with you are from, and really know that if they are not showing desirable behaviors and performance, try to understand and make better explanations of why that may be the case. And especially they may be coming from a completely different background from you, and they are on a very different hierarchy within the organization than you. So being able to take the perspective of the other side and understand the contextual influences is a key for a manager to create an inclusive workplace.
I think this COVID situation brought some really harsh realities to what we're facing. I was recently talking to somebody who is in I don't think he's in extreme poverty, but he's the only breadwinner of a family of 6. And he was telling me that the government changed the regulations almost from a day to another regarding children going back to school. And he said, it's very, very hard for us because now we have to buy the kids shoes, and we don't have money for shoes because we didn't know that this is going to happen when we don't have money for shoes. And I was thinking, I bet you whoever makes those decisions are not thinking about this level of poverty. They're not thinking about the fact that I cannot send my child to school because they outgrown their shoes and they don't have enough shoes. We don't have enough money to buy a simple pair of shoes to go to school, let alone maybe pack their lunch instead of being at home and maybe sharing a little lunch.
Right. So for managers, they have a lot of blind spots, especially when you're working with people from all sorts of backgrounds. So being aware, first of all, of those blind spots that you may have. And then second, to do something about it. Try to listen, which is another important smart skill that you talked about in this wonderful book. To listen, pay attention to what people working with you bring to you, what their voices are, and understand the challenges they face and help them overcome the barriers and be more inclusive. I think that's also a great key. And also, humility, which is another very important smart skill you talk about. A great leader, in my opinion, is someone who is confident but also humble to learn from people working with you and working for you, and people from traditionally not prestige backgrounds. So
that is so true. I mean, I'm thinking about, even in an environment like ASB, which I think is very flat, right? And we hope to make it very flat and very inclusive. There's still some massive economic disparagement between, some of the very high paid people and some of the lower end paid people. And like I said, I think COVID created even a bigger crate between this kind of economic stratas. But I think you're absolutely right. The capacity to listen really carefully and maybe be even more humble than we were before, to realize that if for you COVID only meant that you have to work from home, for somebody else meant that all of a sudden now they have an additional expense, which is I have to pay for extra internet, extra electricity, which is a huge cost to otherwise a very stripped household already.
Right.
I keep thinking about the statement that you made before and how it made you uncomfortable. And you said that hearing some things when you were growing up, it made you feel very uncomfortable. I think about some of the things that I was growing up with, and I felt like it was natural. And now I look back and I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe we were saying those things. But one of the things that you said, it was, poor people tend to be lazier. So did you figure out what made you uncomfortable?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in my research, what I learned was not just the finding itself, but also there are so many biases that people can have when we are attributing causes to others' behaviors. So if you look and pay closer attention to those statements that I said earlier, such as, people of color brings trouble to our society, or poor people are lazier. So those are all statements.
Or women don't work that hard because they are busy with taking care of the family, right?
Exactly. So those are the statements, if you look more closely, all imply our explanations of others' behaviors. So we are attributing causes to why people behave in certain ways. So if you see poor people suffering, you immediately think that, oh, it must be because they are lazy, and that's why they fall into this the life circumstances they are in right now. But what's missing right there is a much larger piece of the picture, which is the contextual influence of why they are behaving this way. And maybe showing such behavior is helping them survive to the next day, but not necessarily beneficial for their future. And this is what they have to do because of the circumstances they are in. And also, if you come across communities that happen to have a higher crime rate and happen to be occupied by a higher percentage of people of color, then you may immediately think that, okay, these are the people who bring troubles to the society and causes more crime. But what's missing there is also, again, the contextual factor that may both influence the reason why these people gather in this community and also why there's a higher crime rate. So we are missing this common causal influences on the relationship we observe. So,
why do we make this? Why do we make this attribution? I feel like all of a sudden everybody's a psychologist, and we all make assumptions about behaviors without really looking at the true cause, right?
So that's a very interesting concept that some psychologists talked about. So in nature, we are all psychologists. We are always trying to assign reasons for people's behaviors all the time. We do that all the time, and we're doing the job of psychologists in our daily lives. And you know, because we do it so often, there are shortcuts that we take.
Oh, yes.
And this is one of the shortcuts that we take when we are seeing others' behaviors that are counterintuitive to those. And we create categories. That's why a lot of discrimination.
And that's why a lot of stereotypes happen, because it's so much faster to take a shortcut to a category that you can identify so you don't have to think too hard, right?
Exactly. And also it makes us feel like the world is more fair. So poor people suffering, it makes us uncomfortable. So yes, when it's their fault, we perceive the world is more fair. But those are the biases. Those are the reasons why we sometimes have these biases when we are attributing reasons to others' behaviors. And we really need to be very careful.
You know what I learned in this work that I've been doing for this book? I learned that knowing more about the SMART skills helped me be a little bit more aware of the shortcuts. For example, if I'm in a meeting with somebody and I feel like they are so annoying because they constantly talk about themselves, now that I know there's a word for that and it's self-validation, I'm not saying that I'm a lot more tolerant, but I have a little bit more empathy. And I maybe don't jump right away at their throats and be like, oh, stop talking about yourself. Because I understand that it's maybe a behavior that comes from the need for validation because that person doesn't feel heard. Or if I feel that somebody is losing their coolness in a meeting and it repeats often and often, I'm like, well, maybe their emotional maturity is lower because they haven't had an opportunity to develop it further. And what I'm hoping for maybe is too much. You know, I'm still trying to be very humble about this project, and I'm so grateful that you want to contribute to it. But I'm hoping that if nothing, we don't learn anything else. We learn that at least we're all equally imperfect, that we take these shortcuts that you mentioned about, and that we all try to be psychologists by nature, but we are not trained to be psychologists, right? So we make the mistakes of somebody who's like just looking for that shortcut that you mentioned.
Right. But you are a great example of a good leader. You're trying so hard to understand why people are showing immature behaviors at workplaces, why people are seeking validation. And that's a really important trait that leaders should develop within themselves, which is empathy and perspective taking, right? Yeah. And it's connected with a lot of the SMART skills that you talked about. But I think what's key in those skills is being able to have several explanations of why people behave in certain ways,
Exactly.
not just attributing to their personalities and their individual characteristics, but also explaining in a way that there may be something else going on in their lives. Maybe the context they are from, the economic disadvantages that they grew up with, causes them to behave in a way that don't seem to fit into our current environment. But it may be because our environment has been created in a way to reinforce the privileges, especially the hidden privileges that we don't tend to observe. And for example, I don't know if I'm going too deep in this, but I'm just
this is
so
fascinating.
passionate.
I'm interested. I'm self-absorbed in this because I really care about this subject. So please go ahead.
Thank you. So there's recent studies that show workplaces nowadays we tend to value people who pursue their dreams, pursue their goals, pursue their careers over a long time, and we value that persistence.
Yeah.
And we also value people who show independent behaviors. But then we need to take a step back now to really think about those are the skills that are more easily to be embraced and possessed by people with privileged backgrounds or people growing up with enough resources. So they have they can take the risk, they can afford the risk to pursue their dream and pursue goals.
Because those goals are attainable and they have probably also role models that says, you can do it, right?
Exactly. And imagining a great future just comes with a lot of joys to these people. But on the other hand, people growing up poor may not have enough resources for them to give up, their part-time jobs right now to pursue something that may or may not turn out to work in their lives. And imagining future may just comes with a lot of anxiety and fear to them. So the emotions attached to the experience of time is also very different for these people. So now I think that managers should need to be aware of these unseen and hidden privileges within the workplace and look at the system that you create and what are you reinforcing.
And when you're talking about privileged, when you're talking about affluent, we're not talking about the millionaires of the world, right? We're talking about the people who can afford to pay rent 6 months in advance, right?
Right. So even a difference between middle class and lower class can be quite large.
That's so interesting. I'm thinking about how we always ask children, what do you want to do when you grow up? And for somebody who comes from a middle class versus from somebody who comes from a very, very poor background, that question can create, like you said, either joy or anxiety.
Exactly.
Right? Not to mention that for somebody in a very, very poor background, your choice might be perceived as counterproductive to the family survivor, right?
Right. There are a lot of cost for pursuing dreams. Exactly. That's something I have thought about recently.
Cost of pursuing a dream. Oh my God.
Right. And not just the economic cost, but also ethical cost. So there's something I've been reading and listening a lot about, which is trying to move socially upward can sometimes mean cutting social ties from your families and your neighbors and friends you grew up with for those from underprivileged backgrounds, but not so much for people who grew up with wealthy and affluent resources.
Or at least sufficient resources.
Right.
I think this should be the title of your next book. What's the cost of pursuing a dream?
Somebody is already talking about it, so I didn't invent it. But it's
I know, but you're just validating that this is a topic that we should pay attention to. And when we think about productive inclusion, I think being aware of the fact that I can afford to dream and you cannot makes all the difference between my survival rate and your survival rate.